Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And the 2041 season has been going reasonably well for our Oakland A's as we sit here on July 11th, 2041, 53-34 record, 9 games up on the Angels in the American League West, and we have the best record in the American League. We are reasonably far behind both the Rockies and the Phillies in the race for the best record in all of baseball. The Phillies at this point are 4 games up on us after having won their last 4. We are 3-1 over our last 4. Still certainly an opportunity for us to claim home field throughout the playoffs if we finish off the last 2.5 months of the season strong. But at the very least, we want to ensure that we win the AL West again and hopefully set ourselves up for a first-round bye and ideally home field advantage throughout the American League playoffs at the very least. And the main focus of this episode is going to be the 2041 first-year player draft, which I previewed at the end of our last episode and got some really good feedback over the last 24 hours from the Worldwide Scouting Department on what you would recommend we do with the next pick in the draft and with the supplemental picks we got from the departures of Jake Ortega and Chase Dora. We have 3 of the next 8 picks. The final pick in the regular first round, which is on the clock right now, and then the 6th and 7th supplemental picks for the first round, which we picked up because of those players that we made a qualifying offer to who chose to seek much greener pastures somewhere else, as we expected. But before we get to the draft, 2 other things that we want to address. And the first is a trade. When we did our midseason review, the episode before last talked about our relief pitching this year hasn't been great. And certainly our closer, Chuck Huntley, who will soon be our former closer, at least for the time being, has not been great either with a 5.56 ERA. So although we really like our young pitching, particularly our young relievers, with the significant injuries we've suffered to our starting rotation with both Jesus Saldana and Ernesto Comunez out for the rest of this season, felt like supplementing our pitching might be a direction that we could go. And there was a very interesting pitcher on the trade market, and we've made an offer to Texas that has been accepted. It's ultimately going to be a 6-for-1 deal. I know some of you don't like these larger deals, but honestly, 2 of these prospects would have gotten the deal done. But being a poor team in Oakland, we try to, even when it's just taken on a contract for 2.5 months, that's all this would be, try to get the opposition to retain as much of that money as possible so there's not as significant an impact on our finances, given that typically after we win the World Series, John Fisher still decides to cut our budget. So we just have to be careful with the spending. But 2 of these guys would have gotten this deal done. The rest of them were to just get Texas, our longtime rival in the division, who's having a very tough year this year, give them some extra players so they'll keep more of the contract of the player that we're renting. The most significant guy that we're giving up is minor league catcher Joe Peterson. You may remember him. He was a 3rd-round pick just 3 years ago in 2038. Still looks like he could be a competent major leaguer if he fully develops. We promoted him from A-ball to high A-ball early this year. Unfortunately, he's been pretty brutal in high A-ball, hitting just a $164. Still has some work to do with the bat as a 21-year-old. Don't see him being a big-time prospect, but certainly someone who I think could help in the majors down the line. Rogelio Delci is a pitcher who made his debut for us recently in the DSL. With his lack of stuff, not viewing him as a big-time prospect, even though he certainly has some very positive things, including pinpoint control when he's fully developed, we think. Johnny Kurtz, center fielder, is a former 6th-round pick in 2036. Looks like he could be a useful 5th outfielder. I don't think he's much more than that, but he's having a nice year in high A ball, 14 home runs in 311 at-bats with a 137 WRC plus and a 3.2 WAR. Probably, honestly, more of a corner outfielder than a center fielder. Again, I'd say Peterson, Delchi, and Kurtz are probably 3 of the more interesting players that we've included. And I think the ceiling for Kurtz is a 4th or 5th outfielder. The ceiling for Peterson is probably a good backup catcher. So I don't feel like we're giving up anything exorbitant. And then, as I mentioned, the rest of these players are just to get Texas to retain a good chunk of Padilla's contract, since we are so destitute in Oakland. Right fielder Jesus Mora, another guy who looks like at 23 years old, having a really nice year in high A ball, but more of a 4th or 5th outfielder at the major league level. Shortstop Ignacio Rojas, guy who could be a utility infielder down the line at the major league level, but he's struggling in his introduction to A ball this year. And then a 22-year-old minor league left-handed pitcher, Jorge Gomez. Those of you who have followed me over the years know that the poor control that we think Gomez has made me more than willing to include him in this deal. Looks like a guy who could be a back of the rotation starter, or certainly perhaps an interesting left-handed arm out of the bullpen. 7-7 with a 3.29 ERA and high A ball this year. So I think you can argue that maybe 4 of these 6 players that we're giving up will ultimately be major leaguers, and probably 2 of them may have legitimate major league careers, likely primarily as backups, unless something really funky happens with talent change randomness. But there's certainly nobody on this list that's on the top of our prospect list. And even though we did invest a 3rd-round pick in Peterson not that long ago, don't see him necessarily developing the way that we had hoped when we picked him up. So feel like the price in terms of players is, although they're all between 19 and 23 years old, and or 24 years old, I guess, and theoretically have the opportunity to really break out from what we think they are, there's no one here that was going to keep me from doing a deal that could be impactful. And I think we are making an impactful deal, renting the closer of the Texas Rangers, who's going to become the closer of the Oakland A's, Juan Padilla. All Padilla has done is win 4 Mariano Rivera Awards over the course of his career, including the last 2 in the American League for our rival Texas Rangers. Having a bit of an off year by his standards this year with a 3.82 ERA, but he's 31 years old, extreme ground ball tendencies. Taking a look at the scouting for him, he's always thrown in those low to mid 90s over the last several years, so it's not like he's fallen off a cliff yet. We think his stuff, his movement and control are kind of as good as they have ever been, and he is a very good major league reliever. Spent a fair amount of time earlier in his career as a starter with San Francisco, where he was reasonably effective as well, but he's moved into a closer role more recently, and he was also a closer very early in his career with the Giants. But a 161 ERA plus and a 67 FIP minus over his career. Has been a very valuable relief pitcher, and we think that the right-hander can do a great job for us as our closer, making almost $26 million, so you can understand, even though we're more than halfway through the year, that would have been a huge number for us to take on for the Oakland A's, which is why we were so insistent on including another 3 extra players or so in the deal to get Texas to keep a bigger chunk of that contract. It's a total rental. He's going to be a free agent after this season, and I'm sure he's going to be looking for big money on the free agent market that we won't be able to pay. But think that the addition of Padilla with his brilliant stuff to go with above average movement and above average control, and a lot of experience as a very effective major league closer. Will hopefully bolster the bullpen, let Mr. Huntley move into a lower stress role, and hopefully let everyone else in the bullpen drop down a notch in terms of the magnitude of the innings that they're pitching. And the hope is that bringing on Juan Keuchel Padilla will be a big boost to the back end of our bullpen for the next couple of months as we try to ensure we guide this team back into the playoffs and hopefully to a repeat in the World Series. So we are going to go ahead and complete this trade and bring Mr. Padilla on board. And the fans happy that we brought Padilla on board. I believe our fan interest was a 96, although since I think we started on this screen, some of you would be able to go back and look right now. So I think we got a 1-point bump in fan interest. Better than nothing, given that it has been deteriorating a bit despite our strong start to the season. So Padilla is going to go right into the closer role for us, right onto the major league roster for us. And as you saw earlier, I already moved Huntley into that setup role, knowing that I was going to complete this trade with Padilla. And one other thing that I've been thinking about and talking about with commenters in the comments to recent episodes is perhaps giving an extension to the young center fielder Bobby Armstrong. He hasn't been great, and he's definitely been tailing off of late, hitting just .222 on the season at this point, and his WRC plus has dropped to 78. That being said, we think there is still room for the 24-year-old to improve. Our scout sees him having significantly more potential than he has today if he's able to continue improving. He's respectable defensively. He's pretty good on the base path, 17 of 20 stealing this year. And we do think both his eye and his home run power could be significantly better. Although he's been our center fielder this year, I don't know that I necessarily see him as our center fielder for the long term. When I think about signing him to an extension, part of it is with the acknowledgement that former first-round pick Darnell Selvey, who's currently our left fielder, will likely be leaving us after he's worked through his arbitration years. So although I am potentially thinking that Armstrong is our center fielder for the near to medium term, it's not inconceivable we could move him into a corner outfield spot down the line, particularly if his bat develops when we almost certainly move on from Mr. Selvey. Arturo Uresti is signed to a contract that is much more reasonable compared to what Selvey's going to be making, so he's likely our right fielder for years to come unless we decide to trade him away. Selvey, though, knows his value, looking for 10 years at almost $295 million, so I think we're going to continue going year to year with him. But back to Armstrong. His demand for a 10-year extension is about $77 million right now. And I think if he really reaches that 4.5 star kind of potential, where he's got above average home run power, above average eye, to go with what we already think is above average contact and gap power, he could be a pretty interesting bat for us, whether he ends up in a corner outfield spot down the line or perhaps improves his defense enough to really become a center fielder for us. I mentioned there's been some varying opinions on him. With the amount that he's looking for, YME943 has kind of suggested, hey, lock this guy up if he reaches his full potential, and he's looking for an average of less than $8 million a year over 10 years. It's not going to be a contract that's hard to trade, and it could be excellent value which I do agree with. More recently, Mr. AO 1234 has brought up those last years of a potential 10-year contract with Armstrong are going to be pretty expensive. Maybe you should only sign him to a 5-year or so deal until his early 30s and then revisit the situation then. And I get that point. But I guess what I would say about Armstrong is these next 5 years, he's making the minimum this year, set to make the minimum next year, and then he's got potentially 4 arbitration seasons after that. So I don't think I'm inclined to just buy out those 5 years, since I can go year to year with him now at what will be pretty reasonable levels, thanks to the agreement between the Players Association and Major League Baseball. But I do think that there is potential some value in extending him, kind of between that 5 to 10 year period. And what I'm kind of thinking about right now with Armstrong is that if we, as I mentioned, look to do a 10-year contract, looking for about $77 million. But if we cut that down to 8 years, we're taking about $20 million out of the deal, so the annual average goes down even a little bit more from there, but we will at least be getting the options potentially to have 3 free agent seasons in his early 30s where we could end up getting pretty good value. So I'm going to offer him less than he's looking for, and I am going to try to actually front load the contract a little bit, because we've got some big contracts on the way, as you know, and anything we can do to maybe spend a little bit more over the next few years to open up a little bit extra for those future years gives us an opportunity down the line when the likes of Darnell Selvey and Luis Godina are headed to free agency, along with Federico Ariola. There's a lot of big names that we haven't been able to sign because they're looking for big money. And if we do a contract that's a bit front-loaded for guys like Armstrong and some other guys, maybe 3, 4, 5 years from now when those guys start hitting free agency, we'll be able to at least keep one of those homegrown players around. Certainly don't see any scenario where we're going to be able to keep all of them. It might be challenging to even keep one of those 3 players that I mentioned, but certainly a front-loaded contract gives us the most flexibility possible for when those guys start making big money. And a front-loaded contract also, if things don't work out with Bobby Armstrong, we've kind of paid the freight early, and that contract would be easier for us to get out of in the future, or potentially offer us some really good value if he develops the way that we hope he does. And as I mentioned, Armstrong was looking for 8 years, $57.5 million total. We're trying to save some money here. We're offering him 8 years, total of $48 million in potential value. So cutting close to $10 million off of the deal, so about $1.25 million a year less than he's looking for. The benefit for him is he's obviously getting a huge chunk of money guaranteed rather than going year to year. And we are slightly front loading it with $8 million for next season, $7 million the year after that, $6 million a year for his 3 final arbitration years, and then $5 million a year for those free agent years with some team options for us if things really don't go well. So I think this could be an easily tradable contract if we need to get out of it. And I think it could be a very valuable contract in those final years if things work out perfectly. And if things kind of work out about average to where we think Armstrong could be, I think it's still a good, solid contract for us as a team, but not a great contract. Worry we might be a little bit light on what he's looking for. He also wanted a guaranteed promised role as a starter, which we're not giving him right now. I think the hope is for a guy who is going to be making $720,000 next year to get $8 million next year, and then $7 million the year after that. Getting those big bucks right up front, hopefully, will make this attractive enough that Armstrong will think about it. So we'll put the offer out to him, and he is willing to think about it. So offer out to Bobby Armstrong, 8 years, $48 million. As I mentioned, not 100% confident that he's going to be our center fielder of the future, but think if things work out, he is definitely an outfielder of our future. And with the trade for hopefully an outstanding closer as a rental made, and with the offer out there to Bobby Armstrong to make a medium to long-term commitment to him, it's finally time to turn our attention to the main event for this episode, which is going to be the 2041 first-year player draft. And as always, thank you to the Worldwide Scouting Department for all of the ideas that you've shared over the past day since we put out the last episode. Always interesting and helpful to hear what everybody is thinking, even if we don't always follow what you specifically or what even the Worldwide Scouting Department in aggregate recommends. I think the broad view this year is that not a great draft. Position players a bit better than the pitchers, and I think I agree with those assessments. I don't think there's any pitchers that anyone's really been in love with, but I think the broad view is we should probably mix in one or two, maybe even three of the higher-end pitchers in the early rounds of this draft. Blade staff specifically said, yeah, mix in a pitcher or two. Dodo Dude liked Zach Davis, the right-hander, 21-year-old out of the University of West Alabama. Looks like he could be a respectable major league starter if everything worked out. But the most popular pitcher is actually a reliever. Dodo Dude, Wyme 943, and Coach 1549 all like the left-hander Mike Bones Mercer of Romulus, Michigan. Some positive personality traits. 18-year-old is already throwing in the mid to high 90s. Potential for a three-pitch arsenal if that sinker and cutter come along. So we think his stuff and his control could both be outstanding, mixed in with average movement. And given that he does have a three-pitch potential arsenal, if his stamina got a little bit better, he could move from a potentially high-volume left-handed reliever to someone who could be an interesting starter if things worked out perfectly. So although I'm not typically inclined to take a reliever high, I do agree with those who have opined that Mercer is probably the most interesting of the pitchers available in this draft pool, at least here at number 36 when we are picking. But it's the position players who got most of the attention from the Worldwide Scouting Department, and I do agree that the ceilings of some of these players who would be everyday players potentially for us in our organization are higher than the pitchers that are available right now. Can't say that there was a great deal of consensus, though. 5 players were kind of noted as top 2 or 3 selections by viewers. Some members of the Worldwide Scouting Department gave us more comprehensive lists of their top 5, 6, 7 prospects, but for purposes of the discussion here, I'm just kind of focusing on the top 3 selections, but certainly there were more than these 5 players who were mentioned when we think about the more fulsome lists and more fulsome scouting reports shared with us by the Worldwide Scouting Department. Mike Cady, third baseman, was Paul West's second choice. Like the durability of Cady, definitely has a first base / third base type of profile, and with potential for 70 contact and 65 home run power, I think he could be a very interesting left-handed hitting bat for us. Another player who got support from one member of the Worldwide Scouting Department near the top of the lists was Ken Farmer. He was Wyme 943's third choice. Farmer, a shortstop, honestly a similar profile to Cady. Think his contact and his home run power could both be well above average. The gap power in the eye, a little bit more meh. 60 infield range, high adaptability and work ethic, also a left-handed hitter. So think that both Farmer and Katie could be interesting guys. Agree with the scouting reports on them. But there are 3 players who received much more attention from the worldwide scouting department. And as I said, sometimes when we put these pools of players, whether they're in the draft or the international amateur free agent period, out to the worldwide scouting department for ideas, there is one guy that clearly bubbles to the top of the list. And in this situation, there's kind of these next 3 guys that we're going to talk about who all got pretty significant attention from the worldwide scouting department. Player number 1 is the shortstop Gabe Kimball. Very solid looking glove, decent speed, and a well-balanced bat that we think could be a little bit above average at everything, and particularly strong in terms of the home run power. He was second on the list of Wyme 943 and Avery Shayam. Kevin McDowell, Kwai Time, and Paul West all really liked Mr. Kimball, and we think that the right-handed hitting infielder is probably one of the cleaner prospects around. Good defensively, decent speed, and a potentially above-average bat. Don't necessarily think he's going to be a superstar, but think he could be a very useful major league player if everything works out. Would love to know more about his personality. Seems like a bit of a mystery right now, but certainly on paper or on our computer screen, Kimball looks like an interesting player to consider. Another player who was also pretty popular was Juan Villa, top choice from Blade Staff, Wyme 943, and Avery Shayam. Coach 1549 had him number 2 on the list. Villa, arguably the top bat in this pool with potential 70 contact and 65 power. A little bit more speed than Kimball, although similar to Kimball, not necessarily the greatest in terms of his actual skill deploying that speed on the base paths. Looks like a corner outfield first base type, good character, although his adaptability is low. Think he could be an interesting player as well, definitely more of a corner outfielder than a center fielder. The biggest strike I have against Villa is that his demand of $6 million is about 2 times what slot is for us here at pick number 36. Certainly not a reason to not pick him with the money we had Texas retain in that trade that we just made. We still do potentially have the ability to go over what we've budgeted and bring someone who's more expensive on board. And the broadest support from the worldwide scouting department of the big 3 players this year went to Eric Norcross, left fielder out of Illinois. Another player with a really interesting potential bat, potential for him to have 65 power or 65 contact and 70 home run power. Probably the least interesting of these players defensively. He's a very borderline corner outfielder. Really kind of so bad that even with that 6'3" height, wouldn't necessarily want to play him at first base. So he's a left fielder / DH, possibly first base kind of type. Also a little less speed and not quite as good on the base paths as the others that we talked about. But Norcross, as I mentioned, probably got the broadest support of anybody. Dodo Dude, Jarek Braxton, Kevin McDowell, Coach 1549 all really liked him, and Blade Staff had him number 2, and Paul West and Avery Shayam had him number 3 on their list. So Norcross, Villa, and Kimball were the 3 most popular with the worldwide scouting department. And here with the 36th pick in the draft, we're right in the area where these guys should likely go. Villa was projected to go a pick ago at number 35 overall. Kimball projected to go with the 10th pick in the second round. and Norcross projected to go with the 13th pick in the second round. So certainly would think that hopefully we'd get an opportunity to pick up a couple of these guys over the next 8 picks where we've got 3 selections, but no guarantee that any of them will be around 6 picks from now when we make our next selection. Do kind of think, though, that there are some other interesting players in this draft. We talked about Katie and Farmer. Esav Ben Menachem also could be interesting. Chris Adams, Luis Humberto Ayala are also guys that I like among position players. So my hope is that although I'd love to get 2 of the 3 players I just mentioned with our next couple of picks, I think that there still could be some interesting players around for us in the second round. And I think my hope as I think about the next several picks is that with this 36th pick, we're able to get one of the position players I just talked about. Hopefully at least one of them will still be around with the supplemental pick for the first round, number 6. And then when we get to number 7, I do think that potentially layering in a pitcher could work. I think that that advice from several members of the Worldwide Scouting Department to not necessarily wait on the pitchers when we've got this many picks makes sense, particularly because although I like a lot of these players, I'm not in love with any of them. And I think it's going to come down to supply and demand for me with the first pick. Norcross and Villa, we've got 2 guys who can play outfield spots that we really like. Kimball is the only infielder that's right on the top of our list. And as I talked about, we think his bat can certainly be above average, and we think his glove can be above average as well. Guy who's looking for less than slot in theory. Our scouting director, not surprisingly, recommends Norcross, who's got the highest potential of anybody. If we were to ask for a pitcher, scouting director actually recommends Sobolewski, the high school pitcher, who potentially has a 4-pitch arsenal, but it's very dependent on that fastball. Don't love the low adaptability and work ethic, but we do think his stuff, movement, and control could all be a bit above average. If we were looking at a reliever, he does like Mercer. And my thought is if Mercer is still available with our second supplemental pick in the first round, regardless of who's on the list as far as still being available with that third pick, we probably do pivot to Mercer with the third first round pick of ours to kind of give the group a little more balance. So we are going to go with the shortstop, Gabe Kimball here with the 36th pick. And now we've got 5 picks until our next one. My hope is that at least one of the outfielders, Norcross or Villa, will still be on the board. As we talked about, Villa in the mock draft was set to go 35th, so he should already be off the board. But I do think that big price tag is scaring people off of Villa. My hope is that Norcross falls to us in a few more picks. Remember, he in the mock draft is expected to go 13th in the second round. So not inconceivable that they both could be on the board for us. We will see. And they both are still on the board for us, along with Ben Menachem, Katie, Farmer, Adams, Ayala. So I think there's not a horrible chance that some of the guys that we like may fall to us with a second round pick. The big question is Mercer still available? And he is. So kind of worked out the way that we would have hoped. And I'm going to go with Norcross. I feel like with that $6 million price tag, Villa is a guy who could end up sliding for a few rounds. Although he was the favorite of 3 members of the Worldwide Scouting Department, he only got 4 kind of top tier votes, period. So he was a little less popular than both Kimball and Norcross overall. like the balance of Norcross's bat, and I also just like the fact that he's a lot cheaper than Villa. Scouting director continues to recommend going with Norcross, and his bonus demand actually looks like it's a little higher than recommended slot. Unfortunately, we'll go ahead and meet that demand, bring him on board, and then we will go with the pitcher that we like the most, Mike Mercer here. He is still the recommend for a reliever. His demand just $240,000, so that potentially could open up an extra couple $1 million for us to either help us make more money this year or help offset the costs associated with a guy like Villa if he does end up dropping to us a little further in the draft. So we are going to go ahead and meet Bones Mercer's demand here, and we've made now our first 3 picks. Got offers out to both Mercer and Norcross, and Kimball is actually looking for a slot as well. We'll go ahead and get that demand out to him. So if we get all 3 of these guys signed, we'll be coming in about $1.7, $1.8 million less than we had budgeted, which would certainly be positive. And before we click forward to the second round and get things moving, Villa, Ben Menahem, Katie, Farmer, Adams, and Ayala are probably the 6 guys left that we're most interested in. So would love to get to our pick at the end of the second round and have choices of a couple of them still on the board. And we do still have 3 of them out there. Villa, Ben Menahem, and Ken Farmer still around. The others off the board at this point, that includes Katie and Adams and Ayala. And here in the second round, probably going to make the fans of Juan Villa disappointed, but with that $6 million demand and the fact that there is another corner outfield type with Booger, Ben Menahem still on the market, I don't think there's any guarantee that either of these guys falls to round number 3, but I think Ken Farmer, the shortstop, is a little bit more interesting. Player with good infield range, high adaptability and work ethic, and a bat that with the potential for 65 contact and 65 home run power as a left-handed hitting potential infielder. Could be an interesting player to bring on board. Scouting director does recommend Esav, Booger, Ben Menahem, and if we were to go with a pitcher, still recommending Sobolewski. But we are going to go here with Ken Farmer. See if we were to look at a shortstop, he would recommend Farmer. Looks like his demand is recommended slot, even though it's supposedly only $850,000. So he didn't necessarily love the opportunity to go to Oakland. But we are going to go ahead and bring Ken Farmer on board in the second round. Moving on to the third round, both Villa and Ben Menahem still around. There was one pitcher I was hoping, actually 2 pitchers I was hoping might fall through. One of them is gone. That is can't remember who it was at this point. It was one of the starting pitchers. But there were 2 that I was hoping might make it to us. Hans Felix Bates, the impossible-to-sign guy with very poor stuff, is not one of the ones that I was hoping might fall. But B.J. Keane, 18-year-old with high adaptability and work ethic, really good stamina, really good at holding on runners, and potential for a 2, 3, 4, maybe 5-pitch arsenal with above-average stuff, average movement and control, I think is interesting player to consider right here, and glad that he's still on the board. That being said, both Villa and Ben Menahem are still around. And I think the value is to go with one of those guys. Villa, as we talked about, was supposed to be, according to the mock draft, the 35th pick overall. But I think his inflated sense of his value has turned not just us, but other teams off. But Ben Menahem was supposed to go with the 24th pick in the second round. And here we are with the 25th pick in the third round, and he's still around. A lot more reasonable in terms of his price. And do think that that right-handed bat with the potential for 70 home run power, an above-average eye, above-average contact, with high adaptability and work ethic is a pretty interesting tool set to bring along. So we're going to go with Ben Menahem here in the third round and hope that perhaps Mr. Keane lasts till the fourth round as a pitcher. Villa still on the market, so we're not the only one who he's turned off with his big price tag. But B.J. Keane is still around. Certainly not a perfect pitching prospect, but a fourth-round guy with good stamina, high adaptability and work ethic, and the potential for a pretty expansive pitch arsenal with above-average stuff, average movement, and average control, albeit a lot of work to get there. I think would be an interesting starting pitcher to mix in with the reliever Mercer that we already picked at the end of the first round. So we're going to go with Keane here in round number 4. Continuing to move along. And our buddy, finally, mercifully, Mr. Villa is off. So I don't need to continue angering the members of the Worldwide Scouting Department that wanted us to pick him up for the last several rounds. But I think even without Villa, I like the way things have shaped up. I just didn't see Villa with the money he was looking for, again, $6 million, being that different of a prospect compared to some of the other guys that we brought up. Norcross, Ben Menahem as far as outfielders, and even Kimball and Farmer as far as infielders. And again, we've also got a closer who could become a starter and a young starter in B.J. Keane who have been signed. So I like what we've done these first 4 rounds of the draft. Obviously, if I didn't like what we were doing, I would have probably done something different. And for those of you who are wondering, Villa went with the second pick in the 5th round to the Blue Jays, so just 2 picks after we made our last selection. One other guy that we had been thinking about went a little earlier than we had potentially thought, and that's the shortstop Juan Masaves. If he was still around here in the 5th round, we would have seriously thought about him. You may remember he's the outstanding defensive player who we just don't think is really going to have a major league bat. Looks like he could play right field or left field in a pinch if you needed, but certainly with those skills, think he could be a real interesting defensive substitute. The issue is that in terms of his speed, in terms of his bunting ability, and most importantly in terms of his bat overall, he just really does not bring anything special to the table except for that glove. And as special as we think that glove is, I just don't know if there's enough else there for him to really be a major leaguer. But we will not get the opportunity to find out one way or the other. We will certainly add Mr. Villa to the short list, and we'll also add Mr. Monsivais to the short list as well to track what those guys do over the course of their careers, since they are 2 players that we've passed upon that were either very popular with the Worldwide Scouting Department in the case of Villa, or just a very interesting profile in the case of Monsivais that might be interesting to see whether he can develop enough of a bat to actually be a useful major leaguer. And here in the 5th round, final pick of the 5th round, our scouting director recommends Darnell Truthful Jim Prescia. Can't get a better nickname than someone being named Darnell with the nickname Truthful Jim. Don't like several of his personality traits. Solid stamina, good at holding on runners, potential 4-pitch arsenal, although none of the pitches are exceptional. But given the negative personality, probably not the type of guy that we are going to pursue. I like at this spot, and I usually like to bring in at least one, possibly two catchers in every draft. Catcher Daniel Ramirez, 18-year-old out of the Dominican. Think the glove is a little bit above average defensively already, and do see him as a right-handed hitting catcher who could have above average contact with slightly above average home run power if he reaches his full potential. Not a lot of speed, not a good bunter, but he is a catcher. What do you expect? But I think for a 5th round pick, if he fully develops, he is a more than competent backup catcher. And honestly, if he fully developed with 65 contact, 55 home run power, and an above average glove, he's probably a starting catcher for many teams in the league. Certainly the expectation is that most players that you pick aren't going to reach their full potential, but I think a guy like Ramirez is an interesting option here in the 5th round. So with our first 7 selections, ended up with 2 infielders, Kimball and Farmer, 2 outfielders, Norcross and Ben Menahem, a couple of pitchers in Mercer and Keene, and the catcher Daniel Ramirez. So I think it's a pretty well-balanced draft class. And if I do anything really interesting over the next 15 rounds, I'll be sure to let you know. And here in the 6th round, there's still a pitcher that we talked about last episode, Gordy Wargo, a guy that we've kind of been following, right-handed reliever out of Trumbull, Connecticut. I think his fastball and his cutter could both be absolutely outstanding. 18-year-old who already throws in the mid to high 90s, high work ethic and intelligence. Question the movement on his pitches, question the control, but what he has in terms of velocity and that fastball and that potential stuff is something that really can't be taught. And as a 6th round flyer, I think Porker Wargo is an interesting player to bring into the Oakland A's organization. And in the 7th round, since we saved some money with that third of the first round picks that we made, we're going to go with another guy that we talked about briefly at the end of the last episode. Left-handed hitting outfielder Lou Powers was certainly not our favorite prospect, but he is a guy who we think every aspect of his bat could be above average, with well above average home run power and eye if he fully developed. Has a lot of work to do to become a competent defensive outfielder, but average speed. Is a guy who, with his 6'1" height and that 45 range, could play first base also. Probably doesn't develop into a big-time major league prospect, but there is a chance that it could happen. And with a 7th round pick, a bat that we think could be above average at everything with really good home run power and ability to draw walks is pretty good value in my opinion. So we'll bring on Lou Powers here in the 7th round. And the draft is now over. Added a couple of other interesting players who were looking for more than the nothing that they would get for OOTP purposes in the mid to late rounds where they were drafted. First baseman Steve Daig. Think that he could be a interesting bat with plus home run power and some positive personality traits worth rolling the dice on. And then I really like the center fielder Jorge Moreno, our 8th round pick. Pretty well balanced. Think that his contact and his home run power could both be above average. Good outfield range and high adaptability, work ethic, and intelligence. So a couple more decent rolls of the dice added in the middle rounds of the draft. And with that, we are ready to start moving forward We've got about 3 weeks left until the trade deadline. Perhaps we've already made our big move with the addition of Juan Padilla as our new closer, but we'll continue to keep an eye on things. And in the next episode, we'll find out what happens with that contract offer we made to the young outfielder Bobby Armstrong. Find out how many All-Stars our Oakland A's have here in this 2041 season. And most importantly, figure out if we're going to do anything before the All-Star break. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.